I think there's a thumbs up. Okay, a little dark. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the forum. Our guest today is Jonathan Kuttab. He is, let's see, I've actually got the official bio. I'd rather say some other things, but he's a creative force and co-founder of Sabeel, which those of us who've been to the Holy Land are familiar with. Co-founder of the human rights group OHAK, which Israeli government, I believe, is trying to ban right now, and co-founder of Nonviolence International. He's a well-known human rights attorney, practices in the US, Palestine, and Israel, was recently in Israel and had time to go represent some of his clients, which included Tent of Nations. We certainly buy olive oil and support them. He serves on the board of the Bethlehem Bible College and is president of the whole board of Holy Land Trust. He has his JD from UVA and has taken a leading role in legal negotiations between Israel and the PLO. He's a resident of East Jerusalem and author of Beyond the Two-State Solution, suggesting that any Israeli-Palestine resolution be predicated on the existential needs of the two parties. And he was with us just about a year ago to talk about that. So, Jonathan, I hope I got those details right. If you'd like to take
That's wonderful. Plenty, thank you.
If you'd like to take it from here, and then eventually we go to questions.
Very good. First of all, thank you all for showing up. As I understand, you have been spiritually fed and are ready for maybe the appetizer or the dessert. The topic I've been asked to speak about is how does one go about defending human rights in a situation like this? And in a way, it is really a spiritual question, because the temptation is always to look for things that are effective, for things that are acceptable. We don't want to be considered fringe. We don't want to be considered out of the conversation. We want to be participating in the solution. We want to feel that our efforts are not wasted, that our voices are being heard by those in power, and that somehow through our efforts, we can bring about a better and a more just situation and ameliorate at least some of the suffering and some of the human rights violations. And all that is true, of course. We want to be effective. We want to achieve results. That is only to be expected. But there's also another role that is very, very important. And I speak this as a Christian. There is a prophetic role that needs to be played. There is a time when we need to simply state our positions and be a witness for truth, speak truth to power, and trust God for the results. I remember what a huge revelation it was for me when I suddenly realized that the liberation of Palestine is not my problem. It's not on me alone. It's not the burden I have to carry. That God calls me to obedience, to faithful witness, and that ultimately He's responsible for the outcome, not me. I don't know if any of you have ever felt that way, but in my youth, I really felt very much the burden of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that somehow it was up to me. And I worked very hard, and it was very, very burdensome. And it was so liberating when finally, and I don't remember who, whether it was Naim Atik or somebody else, in some sermon where he says, we're not called to success. We're only called to obedience. And that's the battle before us. How does this translate into Israel-Palestine? Well, for many years, I thought that a very reasonable, pragmatic solution was the two-state solution. It wasn't the best. It wasn't totally fair. It created a tiny Palestinian state in two parts, in 22% of Palestine. But it made sense because what happened after 67, the world more or less had accepted Israel in its pre-67 borders. And they recognized that Palestinians need a state as well. And so they came up with a two-state solution, and that state was going to be demilitarized, and that somehow there's going to be some formula for sharing Jerusalem, and that somehow there will be a resolution to the refugee problem as well. But that was the outline of a pragmatic solution. And I worked very hard as a person towards it. And I thought that that was the goal of the negotiations that were taking place between the PLO and Israel. But then over the years, it became clear that that was no longer possible. Over 700,000 Jewish Israelis were planted throughout the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. And they were living in Jewish settlements that were continuously expanding, that were taking more and more of the land and the water resources. And the Palestinian enclaves were continuously shrinking, separated from each other and from the rest of the Palestinian population in Jerusalem, in the Galilee, and in the diaspora. And slowly they were being turned into, I mean, they could call it a state if they wanted to, but it was more or less a collective of small, tiny Bantustans whose leadership served the continuing occupation. At the same time, Israel was becoming more and more open about its exclusivist, racist character. This was a place for Jews, and discrimination against non-Jews was part of its essence and DNA. And the nation-state law that was created basically reflected the reality that Israel has no intention of providing equality even to its own Arab citizens, much less those that it ruled in the occupied territories or besieged in Gaza or kept out as far as the diaspora was concerned. So increasingly it became impossible, impractical to really talk of a two-state solution. And then I had to say, okay, we go back to the drawing boards. Where do we go now? And I wrote a little book, which I strongly recommend you read, called Beyond the Two-State Solution. You can either get it from Amazon or you can download it for free, actually, from the Nonviolence International website. I can put the link later into the chat. Somebody found it before. I said we really need to go to the basic orthodox, and we need to work, and maybe Palestinian work, and maybe we need something new that addresses the needs of both sides, that gives them everything they want, but doesn't give them exclusivity, doesn't give them the right to negate or demonize or erase the other side. That's very briefly what the book is about. But to go back to what I started with, what is the task before us? And I think that the task before us is not to be Henry Kissinger and come up with a solution. with a golden, what's it called? The chalice, to find the solution, the Holy Grail, and then go about and convince the politicians or the majority on both sides to follow it. Maybe we need to make a list of what principles should govern any solution. Maybe we should make a direction of how do we approach a more just solution. What are the elements that we need to work for? And as Christians, I think this is a much more comfortable position to be in than to try and, quote, solve the problem. It may not be as glamorous. It certainly requires just as much work, but also the emphasis becomes on the principles that we want to follow rather than somehow finding the solution. Now, these principles we all can agree on. Equality, nice. The idea of justice, that whatever solution should be fair. The idea of human dignity, that people are made in the image of God and should be respected. Human rights, the idea of respect for international law. At least in a broken world, international law provides some limits to the power of those who are powerful. Maybe it should also include nonviolence, or at least a tremendously reduced role for power and violence, whether it's armed struggle or military responses to whatever acts of resistance there are. Maybe it should include elements such as freedom of access and freedom of movement, so that people can move around. And mostly it should include human dignity and equality. Somehow we can, if we can work on these issues, achieve whatever success we can, and leave it to God to come up with the ultimate solution or resolution, recognizing that we are living in a broken world. Now, that is not easy. That does not mean that we look for the easy path. Sometimes it means we have to confront injustice. We have to call apartheid as apartheid and racism as racism, and Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, call them for the sins that they are, and call people more towards equality and human rights and dignity, even if it is not particularly popular or acceptable in the world. I think I should stop here, because the more valuable part, I think, is the discussion, the questions, answers, comments that you may have to my approach. And again, this is an approach, and I really like to say that it is not a solution, but it is a direction. It is an approach of how we can go about addressing the problems that we face.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was already unmuted. Thank you, Jonathan. So we can take questions from the parish hall, or we can take questions from the chat box if anybody wants to speak up. You can raise your hand. Let me put the view so that we're on gallery view and make it easier. You can try waving at the camera too. And actually, while people are gathering their questions, Jonathan, can you say a little bit more about the point at which you realize that you're not single-handedly in charge of solving the problem? And the reason I ask is because out in the congregation there, we have people working on everything from food insecurity to mass incarceration in this congregation, and a lot of things in between. And you get very involved in it, as you would know better than any of us. But it's unlikely that a member of St. John's is going to totally solve any of those questions. So could you talk a little bit about how you came to the point where you realized that it wasn't up to you to provide the end solution?
Yeah, it was, as I said, it was a liberating moment for me because I was totally obsessed with trying to solve this problem because I could see what was done, what was being done wrongly. I could see that my people and our leadership was not doing what it needs to be doing. I could see that the international community was not aware of or interested in it. So informing the international community became important. Documenting the human rights violations was important. Lobbying, pressuring through public opinion, the Congress or the leadership was also important. All of these things were very important steps. And at one point, I think it was on a sermon about Jesus's crucifixion. That somehow, we are still in the Easter season, and in the Eastern tradition, we keep talking about Easter for 40 days until the Pentecost. So we keep saying Christ is risen for 40 days. So it was some sermon about Easter where somebody painted the picture of what happens on Friday. What's happening? It looks like Jesus has been defeated. His ministry has been his followers were scattered. He was himself humiliated and tried and was about to be hung on the cross. And the temptation is, say the word and God can bring in angels and rescue you and take you off the cross and make you the king and you win. And the answer was no, I may win the battle, but I will lose the war. The war is obedience to God and God's will. And by obeying God, it looks like I am defeated, but in fact, Jesus won the battle of good over evil. He defeated death by dying. And then, of course, comes the glorious resurrection. That his battle was obedience to God's will. Through the suffering, through the humiliation, through the apparent defeat, he wins.
Jonathan, you obviously coordinated this with the sermon that Sarah gave earlier.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So nice work there. From the Healy family, I don't know if we were seeing chats. They have a comment: the release, the freedom that you experienced after realizing you couldn't solve the problem is palpable. Thank you. From Jenny is Geneva Everdale is a question. And she wants to know, can you speak a little bit about the change in Jerusalem as far as worship by Christians and Muslims, in reference to your recent article, damage done to non-Jewish holy structures and attacks on priests?
Yes, I wrote actually a brief article about that. There was something on FOSNA, but there was also a more detailed article in the Arab Center for Washington, where I talked about the attacks on the Muslim sites, but it's also true about the Christian sites. And what the point that I wanted to make there was that there is such a swing to the right in Israel that those fringe groups that absolutely hate Muslims and Christians and that want to assert Jewish power in Jerusalem. And if we allow freedom of worship, it's because we allow it, because we are being magnanimous, because we are being good. But we determine how many people are allowed to pray and when and how, because this is an exercise of sovereignty, of our exclusive sovereignty in Jerusalem. So I said that these fringe groups have now become mainstream. They are not only represented in the Knesset, they're also represented in the government. And they have to be accommodated, otherwise the coalition collapses. And these, in addition, their argument is no longer religious. It's not that we need to pray at the Temple Mount. Maybe we don't want to pray, but we want to assert our sovereign right as Jews to pray there if that's what we want to do. So now it's a political argument for Jewish power and Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem. And this is very sensitive because, you know, you can't talk about it without remembering that Jews have suffered for millennia of powerlessness, of being basically persecuted by Christians and not allowed to have their rights, being under the thumb, mostly in the Western Christian world, of being under the thumb of Christians. And now they said, we are now in power. We are now in charge. And there's a big temptation of showing them how that we can do it. Then now that the shoe is on the other foot. Of course, for Palestinian Christians as well as Palestinian Muslims, says, hey, this is not our problem. This is not our doing. Why should we pay the price for the sins of the Western world and its anti-Semitism? So it's a sensitive thing. How can you do that and challenge this Israeli domination without sounding like you're anti-Semitic or that you don't like Jewish power or that you resent Jewish power? That's not the issue. The issue is, can we have equality? Can we have human dignity? Can Palestinians live as equals in their own land, or must they always be paying the price for what happened in Western Europe?
Is it possible to do this work without being accused of anti-Semitism?
No, the accusation will come. The accusation will come. The question is, are you really anti-Semitic? Because in Matthew it says, blessed are you if they say all manner of evil things against you falsely for my name. So if you are anti-Semitic and if you hate Jews, you don't get the blessing. You need to repent from your anti-Semitism. But if you are not anti-Semitic, and if you're really open to the humanity of everyone, and you get accused of anti-Semitism, then there's a special blessing for you, because you are being falsely accused. And the accusations will come. Reverend Stephen Sizer is now being accused of anti-Semitism and being brought before the board of the board of Jewish deputies in England made a complaint against him to the bishops, and that he has to face some kind of questioning. And I feel for him, because he's desperately trying not to be anti-Semitic, but at the same time, he's firmly anti-Zionist.
That's helpful to hear, because there was a discussion here in another topic on race yesterday, and it came out that the one thing maybe conservatives don't want to be accused of being is a racist, and this can just end discussion. Folks in the parish hall, I can see you pretty well now. Please raise your hands or go up to that microphone if you have a question. And in the meantime, Jonathan, let me also ask you about, you mentioned at the start, the prophetic voice. I think for Christians who are less familiar with the Hebrew scriptures and stuff, a prophet is somebody who foretells the future, which is not that useful unless you're writing Greek drama or something. But of course it has a different meaning. Can you talk a little bit about the prophetic voice, what it means to you, what the responsibility is there?
Yeah, well, in the Old Testament, and I think Naim really helped me, Naim Atik, Sari's father, helped me really understand this. The role of the prophet, he's the one who speaks truth to power. He's the one who calls society for its sins and brings them a word from the Lord. And sometimes it's a very harsh word, because it predicts, and this is the predictive part, it predicts God's judgment on them for their sins. But as you know, the story of Jonah, he didn't want to be a prophet because he was afraid that if people repent, God will no longer destroy Nineveh, and he will look like a fool because he predicted the destruction of Nineveh for its sins. In 40 days, God is going to destroy you because you are such a sinful nation. And sure enough, yeah, they repented, and God changed his mind and decided not to destroy them. And he felt like angry. You know, prophecy means prediction. We predict the future, and if the prediction doesn't come through, we're false prophets. No. The prophet is not a predictor of the future. The prophet is somebody who brings a word from God, who alerts you to your sins, and who warns you of God's judgment if you don't repent. That's the prophetic voice. That is why prophets are not usually liked. The Bible is very clear that all the prophets were actually hated, destroyed, stoned, exiled, and even Jesus. He says there's no prophet can be accepted in his own country and among his own people, because he's always telling them, you're doing wrong, you'd better straighten up your behavior. So the prophetic ministry of the church is a very cumbersome burden when you have to tell your own loved ones, your own society, your own political party that they're not doing well. I get more angry about Democrats these days than I do about Republicans. They need somebody to speak prophetically to them that they're not doing what they should be doing, and that if they don't straighten up, they're going to lose miserably in the midterms, and they're going to do even worse in the future. That's a prophetic statement, and it can only be made by people who really want a better society and who are not satisfied with their own leaders, with their own country, with their own ideology, with their own church, that it is not doing as much as it should be doing.
Wow, great discussion. I believe Kirk Campbell, co-chair of the Holy Land Committee, has a question.
Hey, Jonathan. Just wanted to ask if you could describe a little bit about the Palestinian kind of what it looks like from the Palestinian side in terms of organizing for the kind of human rights advocacy that we're talking about. And so I would think that the Palestinian Authority would be responsible for some of that, but beyond that, into NGOs like yours, what kind of coordinating effort, if any, is going on, and who are some of the key players in advocating for Palestinian, for human rights in the Israel-Palestine arena?
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah. I think there is quite a bit of coordination. One of the good things, I'm very proud of Al-Haq, for example, and the work that it has done. And I'm proud not only because they're very meticulous with their documentation and very careful, but also because they are willing to challenge the Palestinian Authority and Hamas for their violations of human rights. You see, human rights is based on the idea of universal principles that should apply to friend and foe alike. And if you're not willing to apply the same standards to everybody else, then you're just prostituting human rights. You're just using it for your benefit, and you're not willing to use it when it comes to your people or your allies or your movement or your country. One of the reasons why the United States is losing a lot of its credibility internationally is because it's favoring human rights when it suits it, but then it downplays it when it doesn't. When it comes to Israel and Saudi Arabia, for that matter, and Egypt, they're not willing to talk so much about human rights. But when it talks about Russia and the Ukraine, oh my God, human rights, international court, criminal court, violations of the rules of war, everything under the sun. Human rights requires uniformity and universal equal application, regardless of who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. So among Palestinians, there's a very strong movement, and I'm very proud to take up the issue of human rights universally and to be willing to apply it to ourselves, our own people, our allies, our friends, as well as to our occupiers and oppressors. And as I said, the first step in all human rights work is documentation. Very careful documentation, because the first line of defense that every oppressive regime has is, no, it's not true, didn't happen, doesn't happen. Or if it happens, it's a few bad apples. So you have to prove that it happens. You have to show that it is systematic and integral to the system. And then the second line of defense is, oh, you are just being politically motivated. So you have to show that you are willing to apply the same standards to everybody. And then the third line of defense of, we will investigate it ourselves, don't worry. And then you have to show that their investigations are not correct, are not accurate, do not follow with consequences, etc. So you go step by step by step. This is the meticulous work of human rights organization, and Palestinians have been doing it.
That's a really nice run through of those steps. It makes me wonder which side you've been working on for the last 30 years. It's exactly what we see happen. I believe we have a question from the parish hall, Richard. So if you would like to go ahead, I believe you're unmuted.
Thank you. This morning, Seri preached a sermon in which he discussed our longing for God to answer our prayers by fixing things, and how that happens now and then, but frequently it doesn't happen. And he attempted to describe his understanding of how God responds to our prayers by saying that God seeks to make things whole. And I'm just wondering how that would happen in the context of Israel-Palestine. And I invite my people anyone who heard the sermon to chip in, because I'm a little hazy on how it would happen. So I hope some other people might have thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if other people want to respond, but for me, as I said, that there are elements of making the situation whole. These elements will include respect for human rights, will include equality, will include justice and fairness, will include ending oppressive practices like demolishing houses on the one hand and then and evicting people from them, and on the other hand, building on stolen property, additional homes exclusively for Jews, which is what we are seeing these days. There are elements of justice, elements of equality, elements of human rights, lifting the siege of Gaza, and a totally unreasonable, oppressive form of collective punishment and just oppression. 2 million people being kept very tight, under very tight control. Nothing can go in and out, and no trade, no travel, nothing is very severely restricted, but based on Israel's needs and what Israel wants. There's no justification for the continued siege of Gaza that's been going on for more than 11 years now. We need to end the siege of Gaza. These are some of the elements that need to be addressed.
Thank you. You know, this is a violent conflict and it's getting worse, but your background is in nonviolence. And I'm wondering if you could talk about it. And it's hard. It's easy for those of us sitting in a nice, safe parish hall in Bethesda to say, you know, we prefer nonviolence. It's different if your home is being destroyed or if Russian tanks are rolling into your city. Or it's easy for us to put it out of our minds that the reason we have this land is the original owners, the Piscataway and the Nacosty, were violently dispossessed so that we could come here and build a church. How do you maintain nonviolence through all that?
Well, there's two answers to that question. There's the spiritual, ethical answer, which says, you know, to kill a human being is really so wrong. I mean, I just recently became a grandfather, and I went and holding this my granddaughter in my hands. It gave me so much pleasure, so much joy, so much appreciation for just the value of life. I said, how can anybody imagine killing a human being? It's just so horrible. So this is one part of it. The sanctity of life, the importance of finding different ways of resolving problems rather than brute force. But there's also another way of looking at it, and Gene Sharp did a lot of work on that. He showed that actually resisting an oppressive regime or a dictator or an occupier, if you do it non-violently, you have a much greater chance of succeeding. There was a study that was done from 1990, I think, to 20, anyway, hundreds of cases in which 1,000 or more people rose up to resist a tyrant or to resist an oppressive regime. And he says, if they used nonviolence, they were about 50% chance of success. If they used nonviolence, there was a more than 50% chance of success. If they used violence, the chance of success was 30%, but also within 5 years, it was likely that the new regime will be as oppressive, that it will end up in a new oppressive, non-democratic regime or in some kind of civil war. Nonviolence is based on the fact that every oppressor requires and needs the acceptance of the oppressed people. He obtains it by frightening them, by scaring them, by jailing them, by bribing them, but he gets their approval in order for the oppression to continue. And if they are willing to risk and pay the price of withholding that approval, of organizing collectively to withhold that approval from the oppressor regime collapses. Because every dictator needs soldiers and needs bureaucrats to run the machinery of government. And if people are no longer cooperating with that machinery of government, the regime collapses. So I'm a strong believer in nonviolence. It works, but you really have to invest in it. Look at the billions we are investing into weapons. If we invest 1/10 of those resources into a nonviolent response, I think we will see that it can be very effective. When the Russian invasion started, I saw some beautiful pictures of people just coming out and standing in front of tanks and telling this Russian soldiers, go back to your country, we don't want you here. And that was so powerful. But then people said, nah, maybe we should just get some weapons and blow up their tanks. Okay. So they get more weapons and even more weapons and even more weapons. And the result is utter destruction and loss of lives on both sides. And I'm not sure that it's going to achieve better results. I know we have to resist the oppression and the aggression, but there must be different ways of resistance that don't require that we become as violent and as crazy and as oppressive as the others.
You're maybe the first person I've heard publicly questioning the extended military support for Ukraine. And I know Nonviolence International was working in Ukraine for a while. I believe Kirk has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Jonathan, I just wanted to follow up on what you're saying with kind of like requesting some ideas for pursuit of nonviolence to resist the occupation nonviolently. And like some of the ideas that we're aware of here are, for instance, Betty McCollum has a bill that connects U.S. aid to Israel to Palestine's to Israel's Palestinian children. So that's just one finite, narrowly scoped approach. Obviously, everybody's aware of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That's much broader approach. And here in the parish, we're discussing the possibility of linking U.S. to Israel's behavior regarding settlement. And so just wanted to get your take on what are approaches FOSNA is pursuing, and BDS is a controversial issue. What's your
There's nothing
and effectively.
There's nothing controversial about BDS. BDS is a non-violent act of resistance. It's tactics that require boycotting, divesting, not benefiting yourself from the oppression of others, and bringing sanctions to bear, which everybody now realizes is what's necessary against Russia. Everybody thinks that we should put sanctions on Russia in order to make them end their oppression. So BDS is a perfect example of nonviolent responses to the Israeli or any other kind of oppression. Now people don't like BDS because they don't like any resistance. You ask anybody who opposes BDS, well, what should the Palestinians do? Armed resistance is wrong. You call that terrorism. And they use nonviolence and you say that's wrong. What should they do? Just accept oppression? No, they have to resist. But if by resisting nonviolently, there is a chance for reconciliation, for a better future. But if you resist with violence, then you're creating hatred and loss and pain on the other side and only perpetuating the continued violence. So yes, I think BDS is an important thing. We're thinking of doing a new campaign against FIFA to try and get Israel suspended from the Football Association because they are violating FIFA's own rules by having 5 groups from the settlements play in their national league without permission from the Palestinian Football Association. There is a Palestinian Football Association, there's an Israeli Football Association. And maybe we should, that's a campaign that's well worth working on. I just want for people to even consider nonviolence as a normal, as an important part of resisting evil regimes everywhere. It can be effective, but it can't be effective if it's just one action with minuscule resources. You have to invest in it. At least 1/10 of what you invest in armed defense. And you can see, and you have to be willing to accept losses and sacrifices, just like you do in war. Because they tell you nonviolence doesn't work. We've tried it and it doesn't work. There's a chance of winning or losing violence. Actually, more often than not, engage very seriously in nonviolence and an effective form. I'd like to think that for Christians, that should be the first option, including those who believe in the just war theory. One of the criteria of just war is that it's a last resort.
Thank you. Didn't somebody say that it's clear to everyone that Christians, that Christianity is a religion of nonviolence? We have a question from Barbara Ordway, and hang on, it's several there. So a couple pieces. She says, I agree that we should resist, but how can we re-educate Israelis who think all Arabs are terrorists? And actually, you could who are taught the others are making them victims. And if you want to expand on that a little bit, you can drop into what Americans tend to think of Arabs.
Yes, the process is difficult, and it is long, and it takes a lot of work. And in a sense, you really need to try and, if not win over, at least neutralize some members of the oppressive society. But you can't wait until they come around. Just like when you ended apartheid or you ended slavery, you know, some people resisted, and they continue to resist till today. They don't like, because any talk of equality sounds very oppressive to those who are privileged, because they like their privileges. They don't want to give them up. And the minute you talk about equality, you're really oppressing them. You're taking away their property. That was the argument of the South. You know, how can you end slavery? You're literally taking away my property. And yes, it's true. Slavery takes away, or fighting slavery takes away the privilege of the slave owners. The fighting for women's equality takes away the male domination that has been going on for years and years and centuries. Fighting for ending child abuse takes away the parents' authority, destroys the family structure. Yes, anytime you are fighting for equality and justice, you will find resistance from those who are privileged and from those who are benefiting from an oppressive system.
Healy family wants to, and they've traveled quite a bit, wants to say we need to be careful about the assumption that sanctions are nonviolent, because they can have serious, painful outcomes. And he's not talking specifically about Palestine, but in general. Does that make sense? And at what point?
Yes. This is very interesting. Many times sanctions are used by the powerful against the weak. The United States is sanctioning Cuba and Vietnam and I don't know who else. And now they're sanctioning the Russians. And the question is, are the sanctions aimed at the entire society, or are they aimed at those who are privileged, who are at the top? The second part is, sometimes sanctions hurt, but people are willing to do it. When we were talking about South African apartheid, the same arguments were made. If you boycott South Africa, a lot of blacks will lose their jobs in the factories. You ask South Africans and they say, yes, this may hurt us, but please do it, because that's the only way we are going to get our freedom. We accept that we pay the price. Just like when you go on a hunger strike, you're hurting yourself, but you're accepting that sacrifice in order to achieve what you want. So we have to be very careful when sanctions are used by the powerful against the weak. They tell you, oh, boycotts were used against Jews in Germany. Yes, they were. They were used by the powerful against the weak. They were boycotting them to take away their livelihood and to force them to sell their shops for very little money, so they couldn't really live. Those types of boycotts, those types of sanctions hurt because they serve the privileged, they serve the powerful. But when we're talking about BDS, we're talking about sanctions and boycotts by the weak in order to achieve equality, in order to achieve a better future. And maybe it will hurt some people, but you have to determine every case on its own merits.
Thank you. I wanted to give you a chance, Jonathan, to talk about FOSNA for those who aren't familiar with it, a little bit of the background, how to support or join in.
FOSNA?
Things like that. Yeah.
FOSNA is Friends of Sabeel North America. It attempts to be a Christian voice for Palestine. It's really an outgrowth of attempts by people in this country to support the ministry of Sabeel in Jerusalem, to support the idea of Palestinian liberation theology, to support the agenda of working for freedom and justice for Palestinians from a Christian perspective. So if you come on our website, FOSNA.org, FOSNA.org, you will see some of our publications. We don't flood you with emails, but we do send an email once a week, an e-blast. I usually write it, some commentary on the ongoing things. We would definitely appreciate your support, both financially and for the different campaigns that we are carrying out. As I mentioned, the FIFA campaign, which we still haven't started, but we have other campaigns for Palestinian political prisoners, and other campaigns that we do. We also have campaigns where we do letter writing, or we write to the politicians to try and get them to change their mind. We are now very interested in the upcoming convention for the Episcopal Church. There are a number of very interesting initiatives. One of them calling apartheid. One of them, I think, calling for some kind of support for Palestinian, the BDS movement and the human rights movement. One of them against a proposal to include anti-Zionism as part of anti-Semitism, because that's the other game that is being played. All advocacy on behalf of Palestinians is seen as somehow disruptive of Christian-Jewish relations in this country and causing discomfort to people and being an expression of anti-Semitism, which it is not. So there is a proposal before the conference on that issue as well. So, you know, FOSNA tries to be a Christian voice for Palestine, but it's not a it's partisan in the sense that it's partisan towards justice and towards equality and towards fairness, but not necessarily anti-Israeli in any way. It's certainly very against most of the policies of the State of Israel.
I want to thank you so much. I want to hand it over to Kirk to say a more elaborate thanks in a minute. But I'm just going to say you've not left us in a very comfortable place. Let's see, we're supposed to try and deal with that problems with no hope that they're going to get solved. And we're supposed to pick up the role of the prophet, which we know where that ends up. And then nonviolence, even at times when it's really challenging. It's not an easy job, but thanks for telling us about it. And let me go next to Kirk.
Yeah, I just want to add thank you to Jonathan for your time. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And thanks to Jay for moderating. We hope to see everybody again in 2 weeks when Rabbi Jill Jacob of rights organization will join us 2 weeks from today. So thanks again and happy Mother's Day to everybody, mothers and children of mothers. Bye.
Bye.